You know, in this knowledge seal, we'll talk about writing up research. And it's both an introduction to the publication process, but also questions about how you write and what is the best time to write. As we'll see, it's important to think about publication because it can be one of the way you'll reach the public, have an impact. And it's also important to think about how to write. So we'll talk about the structure of a dissertation, and the base will be a classic dissertation or not, and we'll take the benchmark in academia, which is the benchmark of a classic journal paper. Obviously, there will be some variations depending on what you eventually will want to write up, but that's what people have in mind. That's a common reference. So whatever you do, you'll be judged also in reference to that. So you have to make sure you manage expectations. And if you do something different, you have to be aware about what is expected in academia. Then we'll go briefly through how to cite your sources. I've put together a guide around that. I won't review everything because that's a bit, it's a bit of a long, it would be a long and boring succession of slides, but you'll have it there. You can consult it when you need. Then the question about when do you write, when do we write, and the publication process. First thing, the structure of a dissertation. So basically, a classic dissertation is a research paper. It's like a big 400-page research paper. That's what you will have in a PhD. Of course, you have other options in the EDBA, but I want you to be familiarized with the structure of a scientific journal article because it is the structure of a dissertation, and that's what serves as a reference to us. So basically, you have, even for a dissertation, you have different format. So classic format, which is probably what you will do if you do a classic dissertation, is actually following the different sections of a journal paper, except that it's longer. And we'll come back to what these sections are. What's more specific is a dissertation that is composed of a collection of 3 or 4 papers. And you see more and more PhDs that are done like this. For instance, in finance, that's the only model these days, because it helps young researchers to actually get published right after their PhD or even during their PhD. So they don't have to write a huge monograph and then get it published bit by bit. It's all ready to be fed to journals. So it's like, makes it easier for them to be highly productive as they are requested to be in their environment. So basically, you have often 1, maybe sometimes 2 theoretical papers. And the classic one is a lit review. Often these days it will have used some bibliometric methods. We haven't talked about that, but it's a way to review the literature systematically, to actually use often some sort of quant software that will connect either in terms of co-citation, who is quoting who, or in terms of thematic analysis of overlaps between research areas. So whether it's a classic lit review or whether you use bibliometric method, which I recommend if you want to publish a lit review only, you will, what's interesting, if it leads to a series of research avenues that you can then work on for the other papers. So that's a classic one. You have your lit review that give you a series of research avenues. One of these avenues can be to create a new model in this area, and that could be a second theoretical paper. Or it might be that you produce a new model as a theoretical paper. Then you can have 2 or 1, often it's 3, but so if you have 2 theoretical, you can have 1 empirical papers that will work on 1 or 2 of the research avenues that have been exposed in the theoretical part. And it can be quant, it can be qual, it can be explorative or deductive. It really depends on what you have on a lit review. Obviously, if you want to write in a different format, it can give you more freedom. And you have that possibility in an executive DBA. You can produce a book, and that's very interesting. Unfortunately, in academia, we are less than before encouraged in writing books, at least in business. It would be different, for instance, in history or political science, where books are still valued more than in management or in business. But books are great because books are less constrained than journal articles. You can take your time. You can write longer text. In terms of writing, so it's freer. The format can be very different. It's not a very schematic format that I will present to you. And there are books that can be, about one big case study. There are books that can present a new theory, which each chapter describing one aspect. And you don't have, the type of documentation is a bit freer. When you write an article, it's a bit, I write one sentence, I have to have a reference to back the sentence that I've written. In books, it's less like this. And, in terms of format, it's very interesting because of that. It's also interesting for its impact. Books are more likely to be read than a classic dissertation. Journal articles, it depends, but certainly for a classic dissertation. Obviously, the question is, how do I validate the content of my book? And because you're not just writing a book, but you're writing a book for an executive MBA, will still require that it has a solid academic background. So we'll want to see the lit review, and we'll want to see how it has informed your book. But you have more margin of maneuver than people who are writing a PhD, and so that's good news. Use it. But before you use it, you have to know what is the classical canonic model of a journal paper. So, structure of an academic article, which is the structure of a classic dissertation. Obviously, you have a title. Titles are very important because titles are what can talk to your public. So to get cited, have a good title. That's for a book, that's for a dissertation, that's for a journal article. You might want a fancy title, but it might not be the most efficient. So think about that. Abstract, very important as well, because that's when people decide to read your paper or not. Keywords, same thing, access in databases, you want to have topical keywords. A good table of contents, that's obviously important, that's only for a dissertation or a book. And then here comes your classic article. Introduction, lit review, result, discussion, conclusion. That's for empirical paper. And it varies a bit, of course, if it's not an empirical paper, and I'll come back to that. But for a classic empirical paper, that's how it's structured. When you want to submit to a journal, always take a few benchmarks. That's very important. And try to follow a type of paper. So if it's a theoretical piece, try to find a similar one. A book review, try to find a similar one in that journal, because different journals will have different expectations. Okay, title, abstract, keyword, and table of content. That gives you everything you need to put in there. In the title, if you can, you need to express the research objective, the type of paper, maybe the key contribution, and something intriguing. So there are codes to respect. If you put influence, unless it's about political science and it's about actors, if it's about impact, for instance, or influence of a variable on something, we are likely to expect quant. So try to find, look at titles and try to understand the codes. The abstract should definitely tell everything about the gap, why this gap is important, the method you use, the key findings, and why you are really contributing. How did you change the knowledge about the topic? I talked about the keywords already. The table of content, should have the right subsections, should include the appendixes, and if you have an electronic file, include the hyperlinks, because that makes it much easier for people to read. Obviously, that would be the same for a book. In the introduction, you want, and that's again, very, very much often the same thing. You want to set the scene. And so you really want to create the first impression, give a roadmap for the reader. So you want your introductory statement to be really strong. Usually you want to demonstrate, so you might have a hook very briefly, then you want, which could be, either an example or relation to practice, it could be that, but then you want to show that the topic is very important. And then you narrow it down. So either the topic is very important, or it's something new, or it's an intriguing case. And then you narrow it down to, your research gap. So, a first hook, an introduction about why what you are doing is important, and then presentation of the gap. You have to quote the main streams of literature concerned, define the key concepts, tell what's missing. So the definition of key concept is important. You have to take the time and assume that all readers don't know what you're talking about. Demonstrate why what's missing is important. It's not because it's missing that it is important. It might be that it's missing because it's not important. So you have to show that it's really, it contributes. We need to know more about that. And then state clearly your objective, or maybe it's a form of a research question, or our objective is, which is the affirmative version of the research question. And then in the final paragraph, quick overview of the methods and findings, summary of the type of contribution, but not most of the time not, it's different from the abstract. In the abstract, you want to list your contribution. Here, you just show where you contribute and say it's really important, and that's why it's important. Now, you will, in all papers, you will have a lit review. In the theoretical paper, that's most of it. And in the empirical paper, you have then other section. In the theoretical paper, you don't have a result section, and the lit review can do several things. Further refine the gap, which you would have it for an empirical paper. Lead to a conceptual framework and or a model, which could be similar depending on what you are doing. A set of propositions, things that others will be able to demonstrate. Remember, proposition can be derived from theory, and they lead then to hypotheses that are more operationalized, or from practice. And it can be a research agenda. So here is a topic